Everyone in the city knew one rule about Silas Valen. You did not touch him. Not a handshake, not a pat on the back, not even an accidental brush of shoulders in a crowded elevator. Women who tried it lost their nerve the moment they saw his eyes. Silas Valen, 25 years old and already the most feared name in the Valen Syndicate, had built an empire out of silence, precision, and distance. Nobody got close. That was the whole point of him. So when Nina Corey threw her arms around his neck in front of 40 cameras, 3 bodyguards froze, 1 photographer dropped his lens cap, and an entire courthouse plaza went completely still. It started 9 minutes earlier, and it started with her running. Nina had spent 4 months chasing a story that kept slipping out of her hands like water. She wasn't a reporter for any big network. She didn't have a press badge that opened doors or a boss who'd bail her out of trouble. She was independent, stubborn, and broke, working out of a cramped apartment in the old city district with nothing but a laptop, a burner phone, and an anonymous source she'd never met who called himself V. That source had fed her fragments for 2 years, bank routes, shell companies, names that made her stomach turn. Tonight, for the first time, she finally had proof. A flash drive, sitting warm in her coat pocket, holding evidence of a financial fraud scheme big enough to collapse half the city's banking sector. She should have gone straight home. Instead, she made the mistake of stopping to verify one final document at a print shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. That was where they found her. 3 men in gray suits, moving too fast to be casual, too coordinated to be strangers. Corporate fixers. She recognized the type immediately, the same blank professional menace she'd seen tailing other journalists who'd asked the wrong questions and then quietly disappeared from their bylines. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. One of them simply said her name, calm as a dinner invitation, and Nina understood in that instant that calm was the most dangerous sound in the world. She ran. Her boots hit the courthouse plaza just as security barricades were being pulled back for someone important leaving a hearing. Cameras flashed. A wall of black suits formed a moving perimeter around a man stepping down the marble stairs, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his expression unreadable, as if the noise of the world simply didn't reach him. Nina didn't know who he was. She didn't have time to care. What she saw was cover. A crowd, a wall of bodies dense enough to disappear into, and cameras already pointed somewhere else, ready to catch anyone who tried to force their way through. She didn't think. She acted. Nina broke past a startled guard, closed the distance in 4 strides, and threw her arms around the stranger's neck, burying her face against his shoulder so no lens could catch her, so no fixer trailing 20 feet behind could confirm it was really her. For 1 full second, nothing happened. She felt every guard around them go rigid, felt the click of safeties she prayed weren't real, felt her own heartbeat slamming so hard she thought he could feel it too. Then his hands moved, not to shove her away, not to signal his men to peel her off him like a stray animal, which was what she'd braced for, what she deserved for the sheer madness of what she'd just done. His hands settled at her waist instead, firm and sure, and he angled his body so that his shoulder blocked the exact line of sight the fixers needed. "Hold the perimeter," he said, low to someone behind him. "Nobody moves until I say so." The security wall tightened around them both like a closing door. Cameras kept flashing, but they were flashing at his back now, at broad shoulders and a coat that suddenly felt like the only safe place in the entire plaza. Nina stayed frozen against him, breath shallow, waiting for the moment he'd realize a stranger had just used him as a human shield and end this however men like him ended things. Instead, his mouth moved close to her ear, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the noise of the crowd. "You're late with that report, Corey." Nina's entire body went cold. She pulled back just far enough to look at his face, really look at it, past the reputation, past the wall of guards, past everything she thought she knew about Silas Valen. And what she found there wasn't the blank cruelty she'd been warned about. It was recognition, familiarity, the look of someone who had been expecting her for a very long time. "How do you know my name?" she said. Not a question, barely even a sound. He didn't answer. Instead, he tucked her closer against his side, angled them both toward a waiting black car idling at the edge of the plaza, and started walking, forcing her to move with him, whether she wanted to or not. "Not here," he said. "Walk with me, and don't let go until we're inside." Nina's mind was screaming with a dozen questions, none of which made sense, all of which orbited one impossible fact. The most untouchable man in the city hadn't just let a stranger hold on to him in public. He'd known exactly who she was before she ever touched him at all. The car ride was silent. Nina sat as far from Silas as the back seat allowed, her spine straight, her eyes fixed on the tinted window while the courthouse plaza shrank behind them. She kept waiting for her hands to stop shaking. They didn't. Somewhere behind that glass, Pendleton's fixers were probably still standing in the crowd, confused, furious, watching their target vanish into a car with darker tint and heavier armor than anything they could touch. Silas said nothing the entire ride. He didn't check his phone, didn't speak to the driver, didn't so much as glance at her. He simply watched the city pass by like a man calculating something several moves ahead, and that silence unsettled Nina more than any threat could have. The car finally stopped beneath a private tower in the heart of downtown, sliding into an underground entrance that bypassed the lobby entirely. A private elevator. A key that wasn't a key, just his palm against a black panel. Within minutes, Nina found herself standing in the middle of a penthouse that looked less like a mafia boss's home and more like the office of someone who never allowed himself to relax. Clean lines, no clutter, no photographs, nothing personal anywhere in sight. "Sit," Silas said, shrugging off his coat. "You're safe here." "Safe?" Nina let out a short, disbelieving laugh. She didn't sit. "You're Silas Valen. Everyone in this city knows your name comes with a body count, and you just said mine like you've known it for years." "Because I have." "Then explain it to me, right now, or I walk out that door and take my chances with the men who were chasing me." He turned to face her fully then, and for the first time since the plaza, Nina saw something flicker behind his composure. Not anger, not amusement, something closer to respect. "Sit down, Corey," he said again, quieter this time. "I'll tell you everything, but you need to hear it in order or you won't believe a word of it." She sat, barely, perched on the edge of a leather chair like she was ready to bolt the second something didn't add up. Silas poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of her, untouched, and remained standing, arms crossed, putting the width of the room between them like he was giving her space to breathe. "The men chasing you today work for Arthur Pendleton," he said. Nina's stomach dropped. She knew that name. Everyone in the financial world knew that name. A billionaire CEO with a public reputation built on philanthropy galas and glowing magazine covers. Not once, in 4 months of digging, had that name surfaced in her files. "That's not possible," she said. "My investigation is about a shell network laundering pension funds through offshore accounts. Pendleton isn't even mentioned." He made sure of that. Silas's jaw tightened. "Every document you've traced, every shell company, every wire transfer. Pendleton built it to look like it traces back to the Valen Syndicate. He needed a criminal organization ugly enough to take the fall if anyone got close to the truth. My family's name was convenient, feared enough that nobody would ask questions once the story broke." Nina stared at him, waiting for the trick, the angle, the part where this became about him protecting himself instead of protecting her. "So this is about your reputation?" "This is about the truth," Silas said. And for the first time, his voice sharpened, something raw slipping through the calm. "I don't care what people think of me. They've thought the worst for years, and they've mostly been right. But I'm not going to let a man like Pendleton bury thousands of retirees' pensions and hide behind my name while he does it. Nina studied him for a long moment, searching for the lie. She didn't find one, which frightened her more than if she had. "Even if I believe you," she said slowly, "that still doesn't explain how you knew my name before I ever touched you. You said it before anyone confirmed anything, before you'd even seen my face clearly." Something shifted in his expression, a door closing before she could see all the way through it. "That's a conversation for another time." "No," Nina snapped, finally standing. "You don't get to dangle a billionaire conspiracy in front of me and then close the door on the one detail that actually terrifies me. How do you know my name?" Silas held her gaze, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer. Instead, he set his glass down with deliberate care, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "When Pendleton's men make another attempt on you tonight," he said, "and they will, I need you somewhere they can't reach. That's the only thing that matters right now." He crossed the room to a side table and returned with a sleek black satellite phone, pressing it into her hand. His fingers brushed hers for less than a second, and Nina felt it anyway, a small shock she hated herself for noticing. "This line isn't traceable," he said. "You use it to reach me and no one else. There's a private workspace down the hall, encrypted terminal, secure server, everything you need to keep working on that drive without anyone watching you do it." "You're not answering my question," Nina said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "No," Silas agreed. "Not yet." "Why should I trust anything you're offering me?" He looked at her then, steady and unreadable, and something about the stillness in his eyes made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have a name for. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "You just have to stay alive long enough to finish what you started. I'll worry about the trust part later." Nina wanted to argue. She wanted to demand he tell her everything immediately, to walk out the door on principle and prove she wasn't some frightened source he could manage with a secure phone and a locked room. But she thought of the flash drive, still warm in her coat pocket, of the men who had said her name like a countdown, and she knew, however much it unsettled her, that she had nowhere else to go. "Fine," she said finally. "But the second I find out you're lying to me, Valen, I walk, reputation or not." Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Understood," he said. "Now get some rest. Tomorrow, we start finding out exactly how deep Pendleton's lies go." Nina turned toward the hallway he'd pointed to, but she paused at the threshold, glancing back at him one last time. "One more thing," she said. "How long have you been watching me?" Silas didn't answer. He just watched her disappear down the hall, and the silence that followed felt like the loudest confession he could have given her. 2 days inside Silas Valen's penthouse had taught Nina 3 things. He barely slept, he never explained himself unless cornered, and he watched her work with the quiet intensity of a man guarding something far more personal than a business deal. By the 3rd night, the decrypted fragments of the flash drive had given her enough to know she needed her primary decryption key, an old-fashioned physical dongle she'd hidden inside a false panel in her apartment months ago, back when she'd still believed paranoia was optional. Without it, the deepest layer of Pendleton's files would stay locked forever. "Absolutely not," Silas said the moment she suggested it. "Your apartment is compromised. Pendleton's people have almost certainly found it by now." "Then I need to get there before they finish looking," Nina argued. "That key is the only thing standing between us and proof. Real proof, Silas, not fragments." He studied her for a long moment, jaw tight, clearly running through every reason to refuse. In the end, he agreed to take her himself, a small, careful team instead of his usual wall of security, moving through the city after midnight when the streets were emptiest and easiest to watch. 10 minutes, he told her as the car stopped 2 blocks from Old City District. "In and out. You don't stop for anything else." The apartment felt like a stranger's home when she stepped inside it. Smaller than she remembered, colder, every surface coated in a thin layer of dust from days she hadn't lived there. Silas posted himself by the door while Nina crossed to the bookshelf, pried loose the false panel behind a stack of old newspapers, and pulled out the small silver dongle she'd hidden there. She should have left right then. She almost did. But her laptop was still sitting open on the desk where she'd abandoned it days earlier, screen dark, and some instinct, the same one that had made her a decent journalist for 4 years, told her to check it before she walked away for good. The email client blinked back to life the moment she touched the trackpad. An old thread sat pinned at the top of her inbox, the same encrypted chain she'd used to communicate with her anonymous source for 2 years. Coded V. Untraceable, or so she'd always believed. She'd read these messages 100 times, memorized the cadence of his warnings, the exact way he phrased things when danger was close. Something about the header caught her eye this time. A routing signature buried in the metadata, the kind of technical detail she'd normally skim past. She'd only ever seen that exact protocol once before, 2 nights ago, glancing over Silas's shoulder while his analyst pulled up the Valen Syndicate's private communication network to run a trace on Pendleton's fixers. The same signature, the same private server architecture. Not similar, identical. Nina's hands went cold on the keyboard. She scrolled back through 2 years of messages with new eyes, and the pattern she'd never let herself see assembled itself in seconds. The timing of V's tips always arriving hours after major Valen Syndicate movements. The careful, clipped writing style that matched the way Silas spoke when he wasn't performing calm for an audience. The fact that V had gone silent for exactly 9 days once, the same 9 days she now realized Silas had spent recovering from an assassination attempt she'd read about in a 2-line police blotter and never connected to anything. V wasn't just connected to Silas. V was Silas. "You've been lying to me since the day we met," Nina said, not turning around, her voice low and shaking. "Worse, you've been lying to me for 2 years." Behind her, silence. Then quietly, "Nina, don't." She spun to face him, the laptop screen casting pale light across both their faces. "Every tip, every lead that kept me 1 step ahead of getting buried by men like Pendleton. That was you. You've been managing me like an asset this entire time. And you let me believe I built this investigation on my own." "You did build it on your own," Silas said, and something raw broke through his usual control. "I only ever gave you doors. You're the one who walked through every single one of them. I couldn't move against Pendleton myself, not without proof clean enough that it wouldn't just look like a syndicate war. I needed someone the public would actually believe, someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose. So you used me." "I protected you," he said, stepping closer despite the fury radiating off her. "Every time you got close to something dangerous, I steered you around it before you even knew it was there. 2 years, Nina. 2 years I've watched every move Pendleton's people made near you, and I never once let them reach you before tonight." The words landed harder than she wanted them to. She thought of every near miss she'd chalked up to luck, the meeting she'd cancelled at the last second for no clear reason, the parking garage she'd avoided on instinct, the source who'd gone quiet exactly when she needed to walk away from a lead that would have gotten her finished. Not luck. Him. All of it. Him. Before she could decide whether that made things better or infinitely worse, a sharp knock came from the fire escape window, 3 short raps in quick succession. Silas's expression shifted instantly, fury and vulnerability both vanishing behind the cold focus she recognized from the courthouse plaza. "They found the block," he said. "Move, now." "Silas, we finish this conversation alive or we don't finish it at all." He was already at the window, prying it open, gesturing her toward the narrow metal landing outside. "Go." Nina grabbed the dongle and her coat and climbed out into the cold night air, her mind still spinning from the revelation, her body running purely on adrenaline. Below, headlights swept across the alley, a car that didn't belong, moving too slowly, too deliberately. Silas guided her down the fire escape with one hand steady at her back, and at the bottom, an unmarked black sedan idled with its engine already running, a driver Nina didn't recognize waiting behind the wheel. "In," Silas said, pulling the door open. She hesitated at the threshold, looking back at him one last time, torn between fury and something far more dangerous taking root beneath it. "This isn't over," she said. "The lying. We're finishing that conversation." "I know," Silas said, sliding in beside her as the car pulled away into the dark. "I'm not running from it anymore." The boathouse sat at the end of a gravel road so remote that Nina lost phone signal 20 minutes before they arrived. Weathered wood, salt-stained windows, a single dock stretching out into black water. It looked like the kind of place people went to disappear, which, she supposed, was exactly the point. Silas said almost nothing during the drive. Whatever door had cracked open in her apartment 2 nights ago had sealed itself shut again somewhere on the highway, and Nina spent the ride watching the city lights fade behind them, replaying 2 years of tips and warnings she now understood belonged to the man sitting 3 feet away from her. By the time they'd settled inside, a single main room with a wood stove, a workbench cluttered with decryption equipment, and 2 cots pushed against opposite walls, the silence between them had turned unbearable. "You don't get to just stop talking," Nina said finally, dropping her bag onto the workbench harder than necessary. "Not after what I found on that laptop." Silas was crouched by the stove, feeding it kindling with the same careful precision he did everything else. He didn't look up right away. I wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that didn't sound like a justification. "Try anyway." He straightened, finally facing her, firelight catching the tired edges of his expression that she hadn't let herself notice until now. "I grew up watching my father run this syndicate on fear alone," he said. "Buy the judges, threaten the witnesses, bury the story before it ever reaches a courtroom. It worked for him. It kept us untouchable for 30 years. And I hated every part of it, because I watched good people get crushed by men exactly like Pendleton, and my family's power never once got used to stop it, only to profit from the wreckage." "So you decided to fix that by feeding secrets to a stranger?" "I decided," Silas said, "that the only way to actually hurt someone like Pendleton was through the truth, not through violence. Violence just replaces one criminal with another. But the truth, printed by someone the public trusts, someone with no ties to my world, that can end a man like him permanently. I needed a journalist reckless enough to chase a story everyone else was too afraid to touch, and skilled enough to make it stick once she caught it. And that was me." "That was you," he said, and something almost gentle crept into his voice. "Your first piece, 3 years ago, the water contamination story nobody else would run because the company threatened to sue. I read every word of it twice. I knew exactly what kind of reporter you were before I ever sent you a single tip." Nina sat down slowly on the edge of the workbench, some of the anger draining out of her, replaced by something harder to name. "You could have just told me. From the start." "Would you have trusted a source who introduced himself as the head of a crime syndicate?" She almost laughed, despite herself. "No, I would have blocked the number and reported it to the police." Exactly. They worked through the night in an easier silence after that, Nina cross-referencing files, while Silas ran decryption scripts on a second laptop, the 2 of them falling into an unspoken rhythm neither commented on. Around 2 in the morning, she caught him watching her instead of the screen, and instead of looking away like she had every time before, she let him. "Why does a man who doesn't let anyone near him keep finding reasons to stay close to me?" she asked quietly. Silas set down his coffee, considering the question longer than she expected. Because you're the only person in 15 years who's ever looked at me and asked what I actually believed, instead of what I was capable of doing to people who crossed me. The words settled somewhere in Nina's chest she wasn't prepared for. She thought about pushing the moment further, about asking exactly what he meant by that. But the soft hum of the decryption program interrupted them both. A progress bar sliding to 100%, followed by a sharp chime that cut through the quiet room. They both moved at once. The core files opened across the screen in a rush of spreadsheets, shipping manifests, and encrypted correspondence. Years of Pendleton's fraud finally laid bare in raw data. Nina scanned line after line, her journalist instincts sharpening even through exhaustion, until one recurring term stopped her cold. Meridian Accord, she read aloud. It's flagged across 6 different transaction threads. What is that? Silas leaned closer, scrolling through the attached documents, and his expression darkened as the pieces clicked into place. It's an offshore financial summit, private, invitation only, held once a year for exactly the kind of people who need to move money nobody's supposed to see. Pendleton's been on the guest list for the last 4 years. He's planning to liquidate the stolen pension funds there, Nina said, the horror of it settling in as she read further. Look, there's a transfer schedule. Millions in retirement accounts, converted and routed through 3 different shell banks before the summit even starts. If he moves this money once he's inside that system, it's gone, untraceable. Thousands of people lose everything, and there's no paper trail left to prove any of it happened. When is the summit? Nina checked the date stamped across the transfer authorization, and her stomach dropped as she calculated the days remaining. 8 days, she said. We have 8 days to stop him, or every family whose pension he stole loses that money forever. Silas was already moving, pulling a secure line from the equipment bag, his earlier softness folding back into the sharp, controlled focus she'd first seen on the courthouse steps. Then we don't sleep tonight, he said. We build the case that ends him before he ever sets foot in that room. Nina looked at the files spread across the desk, at the man beside her who had spent 2 years quietly protecting her without ever asking for credit, and felt something shift inside her. Not just determination, but the unsettling certainty that whatever happened over the next 8 days, she no longer wanted to face it without him standing beside her. By morning, the boathouse had turned into a war room. Nina hadn't slept, and neither had Silas. Empty coffee cups lined the workbench, and the whiteboard he'd dragged out from a storage closet was now covered in his handwriting. Transfer routes, shell company names, a rough timeline counting down to the Meridian Accord. For the first time since the courthouse plaza, Nina felt something close to hope. They had it. Actual, undeniable proof. We need eyes on this that aren't just ours, Silas said, packing the decrypted drive into a reinforced case. My legal analyst, Dorian, has handled whistleblower packets before. He'll know exactly how to structure this so it holds up federally, not just in the press. They drove into the city before sunrise, straight to the Valen Syndicate's financial operations office, a building Nina hadn't expected, all glass and quiet efficiency, nothing like the smoke-filled back room she'd imagined a syndicate headquarters would look like. Dorian turned out to be a sharp, soft-spoken man in his 40s who greeted Nina with genuine warmth instead of the suspicion she'd braced for. So you're the reporter, he said, shaking her hand. Silas talks about your work more than he'd probably like me admitting to you. Silas shot him a look that Nina filed away for later, something worth teasing him about once the world wasn't ending. Dorian plugged the drive into an isolated terminal, a machine deliberately kept offline from every other system in the building, and began running the files through a security scan before touching anything else. It was routine, he explained, standard procedure whenever data came from an unverified source, even one Silas trusted completely. Nina watched the progress bar crawl forward, already composing the opening lines of the story in her head, the sentence that would finally end Arthur Pendleton's career. Then the scan stopped. Dorian went very still, his eyes fixed on the screen. Silas, you need to see this. The color drained from Silas's face as he leaned over Dorian's shoulder, and Nina's stomach dropped before either of them said a word. "What is it?" she asked. "A payload," Dorian said grimly, pulling up a cascade of code buried inside the drive's architecture. "Hidden deep, disguised as a corrupted metadata file. It's dormant right now, but the moment this data touches any public-facing server, a news outlet's upload system, a cloud drive, anything connected to the open internet, it triggers, wipes everything. Not just the copy that gets uploaded. It's designed to reach back through the connection and corrupt the source files too." Nina felt the room tilt. "So the second I try to publish this, every piece of evidence disappears," Dorian finished. "Permanently. No backups survive it. Whoever built this wanted to make absolutely sure that if this drive ever got close to going public, it would take itself apart before anyone could read it." "Pendleton," Silas said, his voice low and furious. "He must have suspected the drive could be compromised eventually. This was insurance." Nina sank into the nearest chair, the hope from an hour earlier collapsing into something closer to despair. 4 months. 2 years of tips. All of it, gone the second I tried to do the one thing I've been fighting for. "Not gone," Dorian said carefully. "There's a way around it, but it's not simple." He explained it slowly, watching Nina's face as the plan took shape. The virus was tied specifically to internet-facing uploads. Any transfer that touched the open web would trigger the wipe. But Pendleton's own private network, the isolated master server at his estate that handled the Meridian Accord's offline transaction records, operated on a closed system with no such trigger. If someone could physically connect the drive to that server and run a custom bypass sequence before extracting a clean copy, the virus would never activate. The evidence would transfer intact, quietly, without ever touching a public connection. "You'd need someone who can write and execute a bypass code in real time," Dorian said. "And you'd need physical access to a server most people never get within a mile of." "I can write that code," Nina said immediately. "I built encryption tools for 3 years before I ever became a journalist. Give me the drive's architecture, and I can have a bypass ready in 2 days. "Absolutely not," Silas said, the words sharp and immediate. Nina turned to him. "Silas, you are not walking into Pendleton's private estate," he said, his voice tightening with something that wasn't just strategy anymore. "You've already been chased across a courthouse plaza and pulled out of a compromised apartment in the middle of the night. His head of security has seen your face. If he catches you anywhere near that server room, there's no version of that ending well for you." "And if I don't go?" Nina shot back. "The story dies the moment I try to publish it any other way. You heard Dorian. Nobody else can write that bypass code fast enough, and even if they could, I'm the only one who understands exactly how the data needs to be structured once it's out, so it holds up as evidence instead of looking like something planted." "Then we find another way." "There isn't another way, and you know it." Nina stood, closing the distance between them, refusing to let him retreat behind the same wall he'd hidden behind for 2 years. "You spent 2 years protecting me from a distance, feeding me tips, steering me around danger I never even saw. Fine, I understand why now. But this is the ending, Silas. This is the story I've been chasing since before I ever knew your name existed, and I am not going to let you protect me out of finishing it." Silas held her gaze for a long, tense moment, and Nina watched the same battle play out behind his eyes that she imagined had been there since the moment he first held her at the courthouse. The instinct to shield her from every danger, warring against the growing understanding that she wasn't someone who could be shielded from the thing she'd built her entire life around. "If you're going in," he said finally, quiet and resolute, "then I'm going in with you. Every step." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Nina said. Behind them, Dorian cleared his throat, already pulling up blueprints of the Pendleton estate on a second monitor. "Then you'd both better start planning," he said, "because the Meridian Accord opens in 7 days, and Pendleton's estate has some of the tightest private security in the city." 7 days folded into 6, then 5, then 2, until Nina found herself standing in front of a mirror in a borrowed emerald gown, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. "You look nothing like the person who tackled me in front of 40 cameras," Silas said from the doorway, dressed in a black tailored suit that made him look less like a mafia boss and more like exactly the kind of man Arthur Pendleton would want at his charity gala. "That's the idea," Nina said, clipping a small earpiece into place, disguised beneath a curtain of loose curls. "Tonight, I'm Elena Marchetti, private art consultant, bored, wealthy, and completely uninterested in anything except the open bar." "And I'm your equally bored husband," Silas said, "here to write a very generous check to whatever cause Pendleton's pretending to care about this year." The credentials had come from Silas's network, forged identities clean enough to survive even Pendleton's private security screening, built by people who, Nina had learned over the past week, existed in every corner of the city she'd never known to look. It should have terrified her how easily the underworld could manufacture an entire fake marriage in 6 days. Instead, standing beside him in the back of the car as it wound toward the Pendleton estate, she found the fear settling into something steadier. Focus. The estate rose out of the lakeside dusk like something built to intimidate. White stone, floor-to-ceiling windows glowing gold, a line of luxury cars stretching down the drive. String quartet music drifted out from the open terrace doors, mixing with the low hum of conversation from 100 guests who had no idea the man hosting them was about to lose everything. "Server rooms on the east wing, 2nd floor," Nina murmured as they crossed the entrance hall, her hand resting lightly on Silas's arm, exactly the way a bored society wife's would. Behind the private study, Dorian's blueprints show 1 guard rotation every 11 minutes. "I'll draw the main security detail toward the west wing," Silas said quietly, nodding to a passing waiter, as if this were nothing more than idle small talk. "Once Pendleton's people are focused on me, you move. And if they don't take the bait, they will," Silas said, something grim flickering behind his calm. "Pendleton's men have wanted an excuse to move against me for years. I'm about to give them one." They separated near the grand staircase, Silas drifting toward a cluster of Pendleton's board members with the easy, magnetic confidence of a man who belonged in every room he entered, while Nina slipped toward the east corridor, heart hammering beneath the practiced calm of her expression. The hallway beyond the ballroom was quieter, lit by soft wall sconces instead of chandeliers, guest chatter fading behind heavy oak doors. Nina counted the guard rotation exactly as Dorian's notes described, timing her steps to slide past the private study just as the corridor cleared. She was 3 steps from the server room door when a voice stopped her cold. "Ms. Marchetti." Nina turned, forcing her expression into polite confusion, and found herself face to face with a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit whose eyes carried none of the practiced politeness of a party guest. Pendleton's head of security. She recognized him instantly, the same cold, assessing stare she'd seen trailing her across the courthouse plaza weeks ago, close enough that night to have memorized her face before Silas ever pulled her into that car. "I don't believe we've met," she said, keeping her voice light, every instinct screaming to run. "No," the man said slowly, stepping closer, "but I never forget a face I've been paid to watch for. You're a long way from the courthouse plaza." Nina's pulse spiked. There was no talking her way out of this, not with a man whose entire job was recognizing exactly the kind of threat she represented. She opened her mouth, searching for anything, any excuse that might buy her 10 more seconds. "There you are," Silas's voice cut through the corridor, smooth and unhurried, as he rounded the corner with a champagne glass in hand, every inch the wealthy, mildly irritated husband. "You wandered off during the most important conversation of the night, darling." The guard's attention snapped toward him instead, wariness sharpening into something closer to recognition. Not of Nina now, but of Silas himself, the tension in his shoulders shifting toward an entirely different kind of danger. "Mr. Valen," the guard said carefully. "You know my name," Silas said, stepping between Nina and the guard with the same easy authority he used commanding his own men. Which means you know exactly whose favor you'll be asking for if this becomes a problem tonight. My wife got turned around looking for the powder room. Nothing more interesting than that. The guard's eyes flicked between them, calculating, clearly torn between suspicion and the very real danger of confronting the head of the Valen Syndicate without cause in front of 100 witnesses. "The powder room's the other direction," he said, finally, tightly. "Of course it is," Silas said smoothly, already guiding Nina back toward the ballroom with a hand at her waist. "Careless of me." They walked 3 full corridors before either of them spoke again, Silas's grip on her never loosening, his pace deliberate and unhurried, despite the adrenaline Nina could feel humming beneath his calm exterior. "That won't hold him for long," Nina whispered. "It doesn't need to," Silas said, steering her toward a service stairwell tucked behind a wall of curtains, invisible to anyone not looking for it. "It just needs to hold him long enough." He pulled the hidden door open, revealing the narrow staircase leading up toward the East Wing's private corridor, empty and silent. "I'll keep the hallway clear," he said, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that settled something in her chest. "Whatever happens in that server room, Nina, you finish it. This is the part only you can do." Nina nodded once, gripping the small drive case tucked inside her clutch, and climbed the stairs alone, leaving Silas standing guard in the shadows below. The server room was colder than the rest of the estate, a windowless box humming with the low mechanical breath of machines that had never once been meant for outside eyes. Rows of blinking lights lined the walls, and at the center sat the master terminal, Pendleton's private network, isolated from the open internet exactly as Dorian's research had promised. Nina locked the door behind her, hands finally shaking now that no one was watching to see it. She pulled the reinforced drive from her clutch, plugged it into the terminal's access port, and pulled up the bypass code she'd spent 2 sleepless nights building, testing, and rebuilding until it was airtight. The screen flickered to life, cursor blinking, waiting. She typed. Line by line, the code unraveled the virus's dormant architecture, isolating it from the clean data beneath, exactly as she'd practiced. A progress bar appeared at the bottom of the screen, 5%, then 12, then 20, each number ticking upward far slower than her racing heartbeat. Outside, she could hear nothing. That silence felt worse than noise would have. At 30%, her earpiece crackled to life. "Rotation's early," Silas murmured, tight and controlled. "Guards coming back around. I'm handling it. Keep working." "Copy," Nina whispered, eyes locked on the screen, fingers steady despite the fear tightening in her chest. 40%. 50. The bypass was holding, the virus staying dormant exactly as designed, clean data streaming directly toward the secure federal server address Dorian had embedded in the transfer protocol. Prosecutors who'd been quietly briefed 24 hours earlier, waiting to receive evidence that would finally give them the grounds to move. 60%. 70. A sharp knock rattled the server room door, 3 heavy raps that made Nina's stomach drop straight through the floor. "Ms. Marchetti," the head of security's voice, flat and certain now, all pretense of politeness gone. "Open this door." Nina didn't answer. Couldn't. Every second of silence bought the transfer more time, and right now, time was the only currency that mattered. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, closer now, followed by the metallic scrape of something testing the lock. "And I know exactly who sent you." 80%. Outside the door, Nina heard raised voices, Silas's, low and lethal, cutting through the corridor with a command that silenced everyone around him instantly. "Touch that door and you'll spend the rest of your life explaining to Pendleton why his entire operation is currently being seized by federal agents. Back away." "You're bluffing." "Check your phone," Silas said, and something in his tone made even Nina's pulse stutter. "I imagine it's already ringing." 90%. Nina held her breath, watching the bar creep forward, every fiber of her focused on that single climbing number instead of the confrontation happening on the other side of a door that suddenly felt far too thin. Then, in the hallway, a new voice joined the chaos. Older, sharper, carrying the particular fury of a man watching his empire collapse in real time. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur Pendleton's voice, unmistakable even through the door, stripped of the polished charm she'd only ever seen on magazine covers. "Valen, what have you done?" 98%, Nina whispered to herself, watching the number climb, her hand hovering over the terminal, ready to sever the connection the instant it finished. 99. 100. The screen flashed green. Transfer complete. And Nina yanked the drive free the same instant the virus's dormant code finally triggered, tearing through the now empty shell of data left behind on the estate's internal system, erasing every trace that a transfer had ever occurred at all. Clean. Untraceable. Exactly as planned. The evidence was gone from Pendleton's reach forever, and safely delivered into the hands of the one place he could never touch it. Nina pressed her palm flat against the cool metal of the terminal, letting herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours, before the sound of raised voices outside snapped her back into motion. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway to find Silas standing squarely between Pendleton, his furious head of security, and two more guards who'd arrived too late to matter, his expression carved from the same cold composure she'd first seen on the courthouse steps. "You," Pendleton said, turning on Nina the moment he saw her, recognition and fury colliding across his face. "The reporter. You think whatever you just did in there means anything? I have lawyers who will bury you and every unverified claim you think you've dug up." "They're not unverified anymore," Nina said, steadier than she felt, the empty drive still warm in her hand. "The transfer completed 3 minutes ago. It's already with federal prosecutors, along with every shell company, every wire transfer, and every stolen pension fund you thought you'd hidden well enough." Pendleton's face drained of color. "That's not possible," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "The virus only worked if it touched a public server," Nina said. "Your own private network gave it nowhere to hide." For one terrible second, Pendleton looked like a man calculating whether violence might still save him, his eyes darting towards Silas, toward the guards flanking him, toward the exit at the end of the hall. Silas stepped forward, closing the distance between them until there was nowhere left for that calculation to go. "It's over, Arthur," Silas said, quiet and absolute. "The only decision left is whether you walk out of here in handcuffs or whether you make this harder than it needs to be." Sirens rose faintly in the distance, still miles away but growing closer by the second, cutting through the string quartet music, still drifting obliviously from the ballroom below. Pendleton's head of security exchanged a glance with the other guards, and one by one, their hands dropped from where they'd hovered near concealed weapons, the fight visibly draining out of men who understood exactly which way tonight was going to end. Pendleton didn't move. He simply stood there, silent, staring at Nina with a hatred so raw it made her chest tighten, before Silas's voice cut through the moment one final time. "Take him to the library," Silas said to his men. "Somewhere private. Before the police arrive, he and I are going to have a conversation about exactly how this ends." The estate library was the kind of room built to impress guests who never actually read. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of leather-bound books nobody had opened in years, a fireplace crackling despite the mild evening, portraits of Pendleton's ancestors watching over a man about to lose everything they'd built. Silas's men had cleared the room of staff before ushering Pendleton inside, and now it was just the four of them, Nina, Silas, Pendleton, and the head of security standing near the door like a man who'd finally stopped believing in the fight he was supposed to be having. "You think this is a victory?" Pendleton said, dropping into a chair by the fireplace with the eerie composure of a man who hadn't yet accepted his own defeat. A syndicate boss and a blogger, playing hero for one night, Do you have any idea how many politicians owe me favors? How many judges I've had dinner with? By morning, I'll have this entire story painted as a fabrication, cooked up by organized crime to destroy a legitimate businessman." "You can try," Nina said, standing her ground despite the chill his voice sent through her. "But the story already left this house 3 minutes before you walked into that hallway. It's not sitting in some drawer waiting for your lawyers to bury it. It's with federal prosecutors, and by the time your favors start making calls, they'll already be looking at asset freeze orders with your name on them." Pendleton's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "You're bluffing." "Check your phone," Silas said, echoing the words he'd used on the security guard minutes earlier, and something about the calm certainty in his voice made Pendleton's hand drift toward his jacket pocket despite himself. The phone buzzed before he'd even pulled it free, once, then again, then a rapid, unbroken cascade of notifications that made his face go pale in the firelight. Nina watched him scroll, watched the exact moment his expression shattered from arrogance into something closer to panic. "Foreign accounts," he said, almost to himself. "They're frozen. All of them." "The federal broadcast went live 3 minutes ago," Silas said, "which means every bank you've used to hide those pension funds is now legally required to lock down every account tied to your name, effective immediately. There's no version of tonight where you walk out of this house and quietly make it disappear." Pendleton's hand tightened around the phone until his knuckles went white, and for a moment, Nina thought he might simply sit there, absorbing the collapse of everything he'd spent years building. Instead, he moved, fast, desperate, lunging toward a side cabinet near the fireplace where a second hard drive sat charging beside a stack of financial ledgers. "If there's nothing left to prove," he said, voice shaking with something between fury and desperation, "there's nothing left to convict." He'd barely closed his fingers around the drive before Silas crossed the room, catching his wrist with a grip that made Pendleton gasp and drop it instantly, the device clattering harmlessly onto the carpet. "Don't," Silas said, low and final. "You've already lost. Don't make this the moment you lose your freedom, too." "Get your hands off me," Pendleton snapped, wrenching backward, though the fight had already visibly drained from him. "You're a criminal, Valen. Everyone knows what you are. You think destroying me changes what people will always believe about your family's name?" "No," Silas said, releasing him and stepping back with deliberate calm. "But it changes what I believe about it. That's enough for me." The head of security, who'd stood frozen near the door through the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying none of its earlier menace. "Sir, the police are 2 minutes out. If there's any evidence in this room you don't want them finding—" "There won't be," Silas said, cutting him off, "because everything stays exactly where it is until federal agents walk through that door. Nobody touches anything else." The guard hesitated, glancing at Pendleton for instruction, but Pendleton had gone silent, sunk back into the chair by the fire, staring at the frozen phone screen like a man watching his own obituary write itself in real time. Nina crossed the room slowly, kneeling to retrieve the fallen hard drive from the carpet, careful not to smudge whatever fingerprints might still matter once investigators arrived. When she straightened, she found Pendleton watching her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not hatred anymore, but something almost curious. "4 months. He said quietly. "That's all it took you. I spent 3 years building a structure I thought was untouchable, and a blogger with no press badge and no backing took it apart in 4 months. "You built it on the assumption that nobody would care enough to keep pulling the thread," Nina said. "That's the mistake people like you always make. You think the truth is slow because most people give up looking for it. I didn't." Sirens grew louder outside, sweeping red and blue light across the library's tall windows, voices rising from the front of the estate as federal vehicles began filling the circular drive. Pendleton didn't move from the chair, didn't protest when 2 agents entered the library minutes later, flanked by local police, reading him his rights in a voice as flat and procedural as the crimes they were about to charge him with. Nina watched it happen from beside Silas. The weight of 2 years. 4 months of frantic investigation layered over 2 years of anonymous tips she hadn't known belonged to the man standing next to her, finally settling into something that felt almost too large to hold. "It's really over," she said quietly, as agents led Pendleton out through the library doors, his head of security following in silence behind him. "This part is," Silas said, watching them go. "The part where you become the story everyone's talking about, instead of the one hiding in the shadows. That's about to start." Nina looked up at him, at the man who'd spent 2 years protecting her from a distance and 1 impossible night protecting her up close, and felt the strange, unsettling certainty that whatever came next, ending things between them, wasn't something either of them actually wanted.
"And what happens to you?" she asked.
Once the cameras stop caring about Pendleton and start asking questions about the syndicate boss who brought him down. Silas's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes as sirens finally began fading outside. "That," he said, "is a conversation I'm not ready to have yet." 6 days after Arthur Pendleton's arrest, Nina sat across from 2 federal investigators in a windowless conference room at the Bureau's downtown headquarters, delivering the final testimony that would close the case against him for good. She'd told the story so many times by now, to prosecutors, to Bureau analysts, to a grand jury that had listened in near silence as she walked them through 4 months of digging layered over 2 years of anonymous tips, that the words had started to feel less like memory and more like a script she'd memorized without meaning to. But this time, when the lead investigator asked her the question that mattered most, she answered it exactly the way she had every time before. And at no point did Silas Valen or anyone connected to the Valen Syndicate participate in Arthur Pendleton's fraud scheme? "No," Nina said, steady and certain. "The evidence shows the opposite. Pendleton spent years building a paper trail designed specifically to implicate the syndicate if anyone ever got close to the truth. Silas Valen provided the tips that let me trace that fraud back to its real source. Without him, this case doesn't exist." The investigator made a note, thanked her, and confirmed what Nina already suspected, that her testimony, combined with the untouched federal server logs from the night of the gala, had fully cleared both her name and the syndicates from any involvement in Pendleton's crimes. It was, in every legal sense, over. It didn't feel like it. By the time she left the Bureau building, her phone had exploded with notifications, messages from editors at outlets that had rejected her pitches for years, interview requests from networks that wouldn't have returned her calls a month earlier, a flood of comments beneath the story that had gone live the morning after Pendleton's arrest, already reshared across the world faster than she could track. Her name, her actual byline, not a pseudonym scraped together from a burner email, sat above a headline that had, within 72 hours, become the most talked-about financial exposé of the year. Nina Corey, independent, unbacked. Right. It was everything she'd worked 4 years to earn, and standing alone on the courthouse steps where this had all started, she felt strangely hollow holding it. She hadn't heard from Silas since the night at the estate. Not a call, not a message on the secure line he'd given her that first night. Not even a word passed through Dorian, who'd handled the legal packet's final federal submission and who, when Nina asked carefully during a follow-up call, had simply said, "He's fine. Give him time," in a tone that told her not to push further. She told herself it made sense. Silas had said it himself, back in the library, sirens still fading outside. That's a conversation I'm not ready to have yet. Maybe he'd meant all of it. The syndicate's future, whatever this was between them. Maybe distance was simply how a man like Silas Valen processed the collapse of everything he'd spent his life protecting people from seeing. Still, the silence ached in a way she hadn't expected. 2 weeks passed. Nina moved out of the old city apartment. Too many memories of fixers at her door, too small for the life suddenly opening up in front of her, and into a small studio near the waterfront, bright and unfamiliar, the kind of space she'd never let herself imagine affording. She threw herself into a follow-up piece on pension fund reform, gave 3 interviews she barely remembered afterward, and tried not to check the secure satellite phone still sitting untouched in her desk drawer. She was drafting a paragraph about federal oversight reforms late one evening when a courier buzzed her studio's intercom, holding a small package with no return address, no company logo, nothing to indicate who'd sent it, beyond a single line of handwriting across the top that made her chest tighten the instant she saw it. She signed for it with unsteady hands and carried it inside before opening it at her kitchen table. Beneath a layer of plain brown paper sat a notebook, black leather, unmarked, the corners slightly worn from use. Nina recognized it instantly. She'd seen one exactly like it sitting on Silas's desk at the boathouse, another at the financial operations office, a third tucked into the inner pocket of his coat the night of the gala. His strategic notebooks, the ones he used for planning moves he trusted to no one else, not even Dorian. Her hands trembled as she opened the cover, half expecting pages of notes, some final piece of evidence he'd withheld, some explanation for 2 years of silence disguised as protection. Instead, she found a single folded page tucked just inside the front cover. No greeting, no explanation, just a short string of coordinates written in the same precise handwriting she'd memorized from 2 years of encrypted messages, signed only with the letter V. Nina stared at the numbers for a long time, her mind cycling through every possible meaning. A warning, a threat, some final piece of unfinished business from the syndicate she hadn't yet learned to fear again. But underneath the fear, something steadier took hold. A pull she recognized now for exactly what it was. The same instinct that had sent her running across a courthouse plaza toward a stranger she'd only ever known as a rumor. She looked up the coordinates on her laptop, watching the map resolve into a location she hadn't expected. Not the penthouse, not the financial office, not anywhere connected to the syndicate's business at all. A rooftop garden downtown, one she'd walked past a dozen times without ever noticing it, tucked above the skyline like a secret only certain people knew existed. Nina closed the notebook slowly, running her thumb over the worn leather cover, and felt the ache of 2 weeks' silence finally loosen its grip on her chest. Whatever Silas Valen still had left to say to her, he wasn't going to say it over a secure line, or through Dorian, or hidden behind the careful distance he'd kept his entire life. He was finally ready to say it in person. She grabbed her coat before she'd even finished deciding to go. The rooftop garden was easier to find than Nina expected, and harder to reach than she'd imagined. A private elevator tucked behind an unmarked door, a keycard the courier had left folded inside the notebook's back cover, a final staircase opening onto a wide terrace lined with climbing vines and string lights just beginning to flicker on against the fading sky. Silas stood near the balcony railing, back to her, watching the sun bleed orange and gold across a skyline she'd only ever seen from street level. He didn't turn when the door clicked shut behind her. He didn't need to. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd ever ask me to." Nina crossed the terrace slowly, stopping a few feet short of him, close enough to see the tension still sitting in his shoulders despite the calm in his voice. 2 weeks, Silas. Not a word. I testified for you. I cleared your family's name in front of a federal grand jury, and you disappeared like none of it happened." "It wasn't nothing," Silas said, finally turning to face her. The last of the daylight caught the exhaustion in his eyes, something she hadn't let herself notice back at the estate, back when everything had still been about survival instead of aftermath. "It was the opposite of nothing. That's exactly why I stayed away." "Explain that to me. Actually explain it this time." He exhaled slowly, gripping the railing behind him like he needed something solid to hold on to. "The day after Pendleton's arrest, every network in the country wanted your story. Not the fraud, you. the reporter who took down a billionaire. And every single one of them was one headline away from turning that into something smaller. The journalist and the mafia boss. One photograph of us together, one leaked detail about the boathouse, and 4 years of your work becomes a footnote to a tabloid romance instead of the story it actually is. You don't get to decide that for me. I know. His voice cracked slightly on the admission, more honest than she'd ever heard him. I told myself I was protecting your record, and some of that was true, but if I'm being honest with you the way I should have been from the start, I was also protecting myself. From finding out that once the danger was gone, once you didn't need me standing between you and Pendleton's men anymore, you wouldn't need me at all. Nina felt something crack open in her chest, 2 weeks of hurt reshaping itself into something she hadn't expected. Not less painful, exactly, but suddenly, finally, understandable. That's not your decision to make either, she said quietly, stepping closer. You spent 2 years deciding what I needed to know and when I needed to know it, deciding when I was in danger and when I wasn't, deciding, apparently, whether I still wanted you around once the story was finished. I'm tired of being protected from my own choices, Silas. I know that now, he said. It's why I sent the notebook instead of calling. I didn't trust myself to say any of this without finding a reason to talk myself out of it first. Nina looked down at the leather notebook still tucked under her arm, then back up at him. Why this specifically? Why coordinates and no explanation? Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, the same fleeting expression she'd caught once at the penthouse and never forgotten. Because you're the only person who's ever chased an unfinished thread all the way to the end without needing someone to hand it to you. I wanted to see if you'd do it one more time. That's a terrible reason to make someone climb 11 flights of stairs. 12, Silas said. But you came anyway. Nina let the silence stretch between them, watching the last of the sunset burn out over the rooftops, feeling the weight of everything they still hadn't said, pressing against the easy rhythm they'd found without meaning to. You have a rule, she said finally. No one touches you. I've heard it since before I ever knew your name. Bodyguards losing fingers, men who tried a handshake and regretted it. I hid my face in your shoulder in front of 40 cameras and half the city's security detail, and instead of throwing me off you pulled me closer. I know, Silas said. You broke your own rule the first minute we met, Nina said, closing the last of the distance between them. And you've been pretending ever since that it didn't mean anything, that it was just strategy, just cover. But it wasn't, was it? Silas was quiet for a long moment, the city lights below them flickering on one by one as the last color drained from the sky. No, he admitted finally. It wasn't strategy. I'd known your face for 2 years before that day. Every photo attached to every story you filed, every byline I read twice because I couldn't stop myself. And still, nothing prepared me for the second you actually touched me. 15 years of keeping people at a distance, and it took 4 seconds for all of it to stop mattering. Why? Because for the first time in my entire life, Silas said, his voice dropping lower, steadier, more honest than she'd heard it in the 2 months she'd known him. Holding on to someone didn't feel like a weakness waiting to be exploited. It felt like the first quiet moment I'd had in years. You didn't grab onto me because you knew who I was, Nina. You grabbed onto me because you were terrified, and I happened to be standing there. You're the only person who's ever touched me without wanting something from the man everyone else sees. Nina reached up slowly, giving him every chance to step back the way he'd stepped back from every hand extended toward him for 15 years. He didn't move. Her palm settled against his jaw, and this time it was Silas who leaned into it. Then stop pretending that day meant nothing, she said softly, because it's the reason I'm standing on this rooftop instead of walking away. I'm not pretending anymore, Silas said, covering her hand with his own. "I don't think I could, even if I wanted to." Below them, the city hummed on, unaware that somewhere above its skyline, the most untouchable man in it had finally, quietly, let someone all the way in. 1 month after the courthouse encounter, Arthur Pendleton's trial opened to a packed federal courtroom and a media circus that stretched 3 blocks down the street. Nina didn't attend as a journalist that day. She sat in the gallery as a witness, watching prosecutors lay out the case she'd spent 4 months building, brick by brick, in front of a jury that would decide the rest of Pendleton's life. He didn't look at her once, not during opening statements, not during the parade of financial experts who spent hours walking the jury through shell companies and stolen pensions. Not even when the prosecution played the federal server logs time-stamped to the exact minute his empire had collapsed. Whatever fight had been left in him at the estate library had drained out completely somewhere in the weeks since his arrest. Nina watched from the gallery, and for the first time since this had all started, she let herself simply feel the ending arrive instead of chasing it. The city changed in the weeks that followed, slowly and then all at once. Editorial boards that had once dismissed independent journalism as unreliable now cited her reporting in policy discussions. 2 state senators introduced pension protection legislation that referenced her exposé by name. And Arthur Pendleton, once profiled as a visionary billionaire on the covers of magazines Nina used to read in waiting rooms, became a cautionary tale taught in business ethics courses instead. Silas changed too, though far more quietly. He didn't announce it with a press conference or a public statement. That wasn't his way, and Nina hadn't expected it to be. Instead, over the weeks following the rooftop, she watched the shift happen in smaller pieces. Dorian mentioned, almost in passing during a call about final case documents, that Silas had begun meeting with corporate attorneys about restructuring the syndicate's financial holdings into a licensed private security and intelligence firm. Legitimate contracts, government-compliant operations, the kind of business that answered to regulators instead of rival crime families. "He's been planning it for years," Dorian told her one afternoon when Nina finally asked him directly. "Long before Pendleton, long before you. He just never had a story clean enough to walk away from the old world without dragging the syndicate's reputation down with him. You gave him that." "I didn't do that for him," Nina said. "No," Dorian agreed, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "But it happened anyway. Some of the best things do." It was a Thursday evening in late August when Silas finally told her himself, the 2 of them walking along the waterfront promenade where the harbor met the last golden edges of summer light, exactly 1 month to the day since the courthouse plaza had upended both their lives. "The transfer papers finalize next week," Silas said, hands in his pockets, watching a ferry cut a slow line across the water. "The Valen name goes on a legitimate license for the first time in 3 generations. No more shell accounts, no more men losing fingers over handshakes." "How does it feel?" Nina asked. "Terrifying," Silas admitted, a rare, easy laugh escaping him. "Turns out running an empire built on fear is simpler than running one that actually has to answer for its mistakes in days." Everyone in the city knew one rule about Silas Valen. You did not touch him. Not a handshake, not a pat on the back, not even an accidental brush of shoulders in a crowded elevator. Women who tried it lost their nerve the moment they saw his eyes. Silas Valen, 25 years old and already the most feared name in the Valen syndicate, had built an empire out of silence, precision, and distance. Nobody got close. That was the whole point of him. So when Nina Corey threw her arms around his neck in front of 40 cameras, 3 bodyguards froze, 1 photographer dropped his lens cap, and an entire courthouse plaza went completely still. It started 9 minutes earlier, and it started with her running. Nina had spent 4 months chasing a story that kept slipping out of her hands like water. She wasn't a reporter for any big network. She didn't have a press badge that opened doors or a boss who'd bail her out of trouble. She was independent, stubborn, and broke, working out of a cramped apartment in the old city district, with nothing but a laptop, a burner phone, and an anonymous source she'd never met who called himself V. That source had fed her fragments for 2 years, bank routes, shell companies, names that made her stomach turn. Tonight, for the first time, she finally had proof. A flash drive, sitting warm in her coat pocket, holding evidence of a financial fraud scheme big enough to collapse half the city's banking sector. She should have gone straight home. Instead, she made the mistake of stopping to verify one final document at a print shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. That was where they found her. 3 men in grey suits, moving too fast to be casual, too coordinated to be strangers. Corporate fixers. She recognized the type immediately, the same blank professional menace she'd seen tailing other journalists who'd asked the wrong questions and then quietly disappeared from their bylines. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. One of them simply said her name, calm as a dinner invitation, and Nina understood in that instant that calm was the most dangerous sound in the world. She ran. Her boots hit the courthouse plaza just as security barricades were being pulled back for someone important leaving a hearing. Cameras flashed. A wall of black suits formed a moving perimeter around a man stepping down the marble stairs, his coat unbuttoned despite the cold, his expression unreadable, as if the noise of the world simply didn't reach him. Nina didn't know who he was. She didn't have time to care. What she saw was cover. A crowd, a wall of bodies dense enough to disappear into, and cameras already pointed somewhere else, ready to catch anyone who tried to force their way through. She didn't think. She acted. Nina broke past a startled guard, closed the distance in 4 strides, and threw her arms around the stranger's neck,